Farewell is a beautiful film. It's soft-spoken and holds space for silences, glances, and lingerings. I put off watching the movie for a while, but when I finally did watch it, I wasn't disappointed. It offered up something I couldn't articulate. It was diaspora on film. It was history, imperialism, trauma, and loss. It never explicitly handed these things over, but they spilled over through the cracks. Its melancholia was thick and palpable in the milieu of the film. What are we saying farewell to? What loss does this signify? The farewell is about Billy, a Chinese-American woman who finds out her grandmother is dying of cancer, and also that her family isn't going to tell her grandmother that she's dying. She returns back to China against the wishes of her parents to see her grandmother for the last time. Also, the family organized a fake but real wedding of Billy's cousin to his new girlfriend, so the extended family gets an excuse to say goodbye to Nai for the last time. I'll be honest, I was sobbing by the time the movie ended. I saw a lot of myself in Billy, in her relationship with her grandmother, in the way as a diaspora kid, she had no way to reconcile this impossible loss. There are some differences. I'm Korean and she's Chinese, and let's be clear, relating to a film doesn't in any way make it a good film, but I feel like it added an extra layer of understanding to the film. For someone who doesn't often see their experiences accurately portrayed on screen, it was refreshing, and this film was based on Lulu Wang's own life, and so there was a certain layer of authenticity that only a certain positionality could represent. Also, for someone who lived in China throughout almost my entire childhood and some of my teen years, this was deeply familiar. Yes, when you leave the airport in China alone, you get swarmed by 10 middle-aged taxi drivers, one with his shirt tucked into itself so it looks like a crop top, trying to get you to ride in their taxi. And I've never seen this portrayed on screen. And this wasn't an Asian or Chinese film for white audiences that just added a sprinkle of the Oriental and called it a day. This was a film that knew what it was and even tried to complicate these Oriental East-West dynamics. It provided nuance to an individual caught in between. I liked how The Farewell approached the East versus West dynamics. I'm not gonna lie, certain moments and conversations were a little bit on the nose, but it offered an interesting take, especially for someone like Billy who was caught in between. In Edward Said's groundbreaking book, Orientalism, he discussed the concept of the Orient, or the East, as not just this tangible geographic entity, but this imagination, this fantasy structure, something that lived in the collective imagination of the Occident, or the West, created by stories, films, etc. The concept of the Orient is not what these various countries actually are, but rather this imagination of the so-called Orient is a part of the identity making of the West. The East, in essence, is comprised of everything the West isn't. In a lot of ways, the Orient is a Western projection, a way to create distinctions between the familiar West and the strange East, the masculine West versus the feminine East, the individual West versus the collective conglomerate East. The East in Orientalism has much more to do with the West than it has anything to do with the East. If the West desires individualism, the East is this conglomerate of this collectivist mess where no one can speak up or stand out. Because it's a Western projection, it's rare that the East ever gets an opportunity to speak back to these projections being put onto them. But that's what this film allows room for. To watch this tired conversation play out in a new way and to further complicate it, with Billy stuck in the middle. The scene brings this dialogue to life as the family discusses the increased opportunity in America, how it's easier to get rich in China, bringing into question what the relationship China has with capitalism as a quote-unquote socialist country. I like how there is a sort of politics and history kind of in the milieu of the film. It doesn't necessarily jump out at you, but it kind of bleeds through in these small moments. China has risen from the Cultural Revolution and this socialist country to this global superpower that's very much invested in capitalism. So it might be easier to get rich, but America has Western imperialism, so there's more opportunities, etc.
瑞带我们去教堂， 等到我们做完了礼拜的时候，他就跟着人群一起往外走。Billy 呢，忽然就停在了一架钢琴前，把手伸过去想弹，海燕赶紧阻止他。这个时候呢，牧师过来了，海燕赶快给他解释说 ，Billy 以前在国内学钢琴，我们搬来以后经济困难，所以就不弹了。
Billy's mom tells a story of how a pastor handed them a key to the church when Billy wanted to play piano when she was younger, explaining that that is America. But that's not all of America, and Billy reminds us of this. This act of kindness was the exception, not the rule. Intense xenophobia and heightened individualism of America isn't known to foster random acts of kindness to immigrants. Why don't you live in China then? Billy's mom says to her. This is punctuated by the utter impossibility of this sentence. We're American citizens, Billy's father proclaims. There is a heaviness to that sentence. What does that citizenship even mean? And more importantly, how do Billy and her family relate to China now as people who have proclaimed themselves not Chinese but American? Billy herself feels stuck on how to feel about it. When the hotel concierge presses her for an answer on if she likes America or China better, she just replies, it's different. And maybe there isn't much more to say than that. The individualist versus collective dynamic is the main plot of the movie. Not telling Nai that she has cancer is an infringement on her individual rights. It may seem cruel and strange and as well illegal in America. However, in this beautiful scene, her uncle reminds her what it means to be a part of a whole. In the moment, the so-called East gets to speak back. It's reframed and put into focus. Wouldn't it be selfish to tell her to spare your own guilt? Isn't this a great act of selflessness and love to hold onto the secret for her grandmother? I mean, he calls her out. She is an individual belonging and unbelonging to this greater family. Although this is Billy's story, this is a mapping of a family. We start off the movie with a painted landscape, and this becomes somewhat reoccurring imagery. The movie, in a way, too, is trying to paint this landscape of this family, a painting that in itself is an artifice. With the hospital sounds on the intercom in the background as this movie opens, we understand that it is a performance of cheer and joy in an otherwise sterile and perhaps sad hospital setting. With Nai in the frame, all we see is this painting. Pan out a little bit more and we see Nai sitting in a dimly lit hospital waiting room. The painting now looks even more like a performance. I think it's important that there were these small lies even from the beginning. Nai asks if she's wearing a hat and Billy says yes. Billy asks where her grandmother is. She responds that she is at her sister's house. These are both white lies, but these lies are important. They may seem mundane, but in retrospect, they are small moments in which Billy and her grandmother are deciding to not burden the other with the truth. They create these white lies to protect the other person from worry. This is a subtle moment, but I think it speaks volumes and sets up this family dynamic of, well, much bigger lies and much bigger performances. I mean, let's be clear, all families lie to each other, but there's something particularly East Asian or perhaps Chinese about the situation, this kind of saving face, this not showing what's actually happening behind the scenes. As Billy's uncle reminds us, in China, you belong to your family and society. And in this line, Nai understands this, and she protects Billy by taking on this emotional burden for her, performing that nothing is wrong as she sits in the hospital waiting room. Throughout the film, we get absolutely beautiful tableaus of the family. Using this dramatic technique, we get the performative aspect of the family itself, the performance they all put on for the sake of Nai. The family is imperfect together, most times out of sync. I love this scene at the cemetery, and I think this perfectly exemplifies this, the way they bob their heads at different rhythms. Billy is automatically painted as an outsider. She stands out from the rest of her family. She is the diaspora's hereafters, more outside of this world than she is inside of it. Here we have Billy playing the piano in the foreground, dressed in all black, while her family remains in the background. This is Billy's unbelonging to the greater family as a whole. She's continually portrayed in these tableaus as standing out from the rest of the group, and a lot of ways this is her story. Billy's unbelonging is made clear. She is perhaps the most un-Chinese, the most American out of her whole family. She is the only one that outwardly opposes the lie and is the one that is most out of sync with the rest of the family. But this unbelonging is a critical part of the story. She's dealing with a much bigger loss than the rest of her family. She's anticipating the loss of her grandmother, yes, but it is no secret that the farewell is much more than just a farewell to her grandmother. So what are we saying farewell to? Well, spoiler alert, she's not just saying goodbye to her grandmother. But before we dive in, I would like to probe the title a little bit more. I was interested in the difference of titles in Chinese versus English. In English, it's obviously the farewell, and in Chinese, it's directly translated to don't tell her. I was interested that in the title supposedly used for Western countries, it lingered on the idea of loss, and for the title that was going to be used for China, it lingered on the question of the secret. The producers seemed to understand that the meaning of this film would be received and understood much differently to different audiences. To Chinese people, the producers perhaps thought that the question of the secret and this dynamic of Chinese families is what would resonate more than perhaps loss. Of course, the pain of the loss of losing a loved one is universal, but there was something more in the loss that was going on within this film. To immigrants within the diaspora living in the so-called East, this film was not just about a secret. Instead, it asked, what does it mean to say farewell to country and to this discursive place of home? What does it mean to return back to a place to find that it no longer belongs to you anymore? This film flopped in China, and I'm not surprised. In this Variety article, Zhang, the Chinese producer, sums it up to not as much marketing being done to Chinese audiences. These audiences deem it too Chinese to be accepted as a bearer of its American values, and yet too American to be accepted as genuinely Chinese. A Dubon reviewer discussed in the article seemed to sum it up perfectly. It's not surprising the film is getting the cold shoulder. China in the eyes of foreigners is always more Chinese than the China in the eyes of Chinese people. This is fundamentally a Chinese-American film, a diaspora film, not a Chinese film. As Vijay Mishra discusses in the introduction to the literature of the Indian diaspora, theorizing the diasporic imaginary, homeland is a fantasy structure. I love how saying the quote was like a lot shorter than the actual title of this book, but it's a good book, go read it. Lulu Wang's interpretation of China as a diasporic subject in some ways is built on her own fantasy and imagination of what China is. This is a film perhaps more caught in the imaginary. This doesn't make it or the loss any less real, but this is not something that will and did not particularly resonate for Chinese people. Because at the end of the day, this is a story of farewells, and the secret is kind of just a way to understand this loss through. So what are we saying farewell to? Billy and her grandmother have this really wonderful connection. I really see it in this relationship with my own grandparents. The playfulness, the cultural differences, the care. Her grandmother, in another sense, is reflective of her only lasting connection to China. Yes, she has her other family there, but her grandmother is the symbol of what ties her to home, and perhaps is the only thing that really feels home in China anymore. There's a scene when she passes by a neighborhood where her grandmother used to live.
Looks so familiar.
Do you remember that house? You used to love to play in the garden.
Where is it? 已经过了。可以回去了吗？
She notices that things she remembers about China as this foundational place of childhood is no longer there anymore. When she left, China had continued on without her. It's not where she left it, and this return is to only be haunted by what is no longer there. The China she remembers is just a fantasy. It is what exists in her head. There is no tangible place in which she can return to the site of her childhood memories. There is also a sense of impossibility of return. This also holds the haunting of modernity and the ever-changing China. Around the dinner table when discussing sending Bao away to university in the US, there is an understanding of the way the violence of globalization impacts the severance and impossibility of return. When Auntie Lang explains that she knows Bao must leave for better opportunities, Billy's mom retorts, "You still send him away even if he won't return." Then silence. This anticipation of the loss of her grandmother is this anticipation of a radical break, a home that will become no longer home anymore. Billy is the diaspora's hereafters. As a second generation immigrant, or is it first generation? Well, she was born in China, so that would technically make her a first generation, but I'm gonna say second generation because I feel like she's really integrated to kind of the Americanness of it all. So we're gonna say second generation for now, even though that might not be correct. Anyways, as a second generation immigrant, her grandmother's death is sort of this ultimate severance, something that there's no return from. Billy is already starting to feel the effects of this loss, the unfamiliarity, navigating these spaces. However, the anticipation of her grandmother's death represents something more final. It makes sense the sort of angst Billy carries around with dealing with what is an impossible loss, of losing home and of constantly feeling untethered and somewhere in between. Diasporic Melancholia is built on a sort of impossible loss, can't get over it kind of loss. I think Billy's sort of angst throughout the film feels super familiar. This tweet kills me every time because there's something so true about the melancholic angstiness of diasporic young folks. Like, there is this loss that we're constantly grappling with and trying to make sense of. There is an impossibility of fully mourning. We're always seemingly stuck in this melancholic limbo where there is an impossibility of moving on or ever feeling fully at home. In Anlin Cheng's fantastic book, The Melancholy of Race, Psychoanalysis, Assimilation, and Hidden Grief, she explores what melancholy means in the context of the racialized subject in the US. Cheng explains in referencing Freud that melancholia is this opposition to mourning, which is this healthy way of getting over loss, that eventually lets go of the lost object and can substitute it for another, and is finite in character. Melancholia, on the other hand, is pathological. It is interminable in nature and refuses substitution. That is, the melancholic can't get over loss. The melancholic is, one might say, physically stuck. I think the stuckness feels apt. There is a certain temporal stuckness that diaspora enables. Again, Billy is stuck in what she remembered from home. She's stuck in this imagined past of her childhood and of China. She's returned to understand that life there has moved on without her, while she still remains buried in this past. Moreover, the melancholic operates in a mode that is both love and hate of this lost object. There's both a desire for and ultimate exclusion and denial of what has been lost. This is what leads to the impossibility of a healthy mourning. The nature of racialization is ultimately exclusion and denial. On the most basic level, as a diasporic subject, you're told to deny your home country in favor of a new home. You love your home, but there's a certain level of resentment and hate you build up against it, whether that's for making you look, feel different than all the other kids in your school. There is an inability to even fully express your loss, and oftentimes immigrants are pushed into these survival situations where they must try to remain afloat and can never really address the loss that their family experienced. My grandparents never taught my mom or her siblings Korean, and perhaps this was their own desire-denial relationship with their own loss. Mourning becomes sort of impossible. Let's return to the farewell. I think that the impossibility of mourning this diasporic loss is perfectly exemplified in the wedding. You know, the whole Shakespeare comedy versus tragedy thing, where if it's a comedy, it ends at a wedding, and if it's a tragedy, it ends with death or a funeral. Well, the farewell works with both discursive spaces simultaneously. The wedding of Billy's cousin and his really new girlfriend is actually just an excuse for everyone to come together and see Nai for the last time and say goodbye. So the wedding is literally a funeral hidden inside a wedding. There's quite literally an impossibility of mourning. They must disguise their sorrow within and amongst joy. But there are slippages. When Billy's uncle is saying a speech about how thankful he is for his mom, this grief spills over.
我最想感谢的一个人，是我妈。妈，原谅我，这么多年没有陪在你身边。
This is both a wedding speech and sort of a eulogy. He expresses his regrets and how thankful he is for his mother. And even here, there's still an element of comedy. Like, this awkward clap after the speech is so uncomfortable and almost hilarious. And I'm sorry, but Mr. Lee is a king. He just minds his own goddamn business. There is just this totally awkward spilling over of emotions, and these slippages or emotional excess also translate into the over-emotionalness of Billy's cousin. It is dismissed quickly as tears of joy, and sorrow and joy here are increasingly muddled. They must perform joy on behalf of Nai when they feel sorrow. This, in a lot of ways, is perhaps the condition of diasporic mourning. There is a hate and love to this mourning, a denial and desire, a funeral and a wedding. Joy that must disguise grief. This one scene is heartbreaking. Billy recalls moving to the States and dealing with this loss. Her parents herself disguised their grief, never told her what was going on. As a young child, she was confused. In dealing with her own mourning, she couldn't reconcile this grief because her parents never allowed her to.
And then we just moved to the States. Everything was different. Everyone was gone. It was just the three of us.
And it was hard. It was hard for us too.
I wanted to believe that it was a good thing. But all I saw was fear in your eyes. And I was confused and scared constantly because you never told me what was going on. And I come back and he's just gone. The house is gone. Adia is gone. Our Beijing home is gone, and soon she'll be gone too.
Billy professes that all these things that came with China as home are gone, and soon her grandmother will be gone too. I love how this slow, heartbreaking, melancholic montage with this haunting music shifts so suddenly into the wedding staff proclaiming their mission to become history and witness happiness. The juxtaposition is so stark and almost funny, but it is so reflective of this sort of denial of grief that generates this impossibility of fully mourning, both for her grandmother, but also for the loss of China and the loss of home as a diasporic subject. Moreover, this melancholic sort of hate-love dynamic is super present in when they're discussing the differences between China and America. Billy has resentment for America as this new country she is supposed to dedicate her citizenship to and love. However, there's also still a denial of China, of her hesitance and frustration with having to comply with a Chinese custom that is this lie. She is resentful over her family, the doctor, for lying, but they are really Chinese and understand it, and she does not. At the same time, she longs for China, but knows she can't move back here, as her mother suggests. There's also a sense of anticipation of loss. Billy's grandmother hasn't really died yet. This isn't so much a funeral as it is an anticipated funeral, a haunting of a future funeral. We even come to find out at the end of the movie that Lulu Wang's actual grandmother herself lived many years after her diagnosis, so in a lot of ways this anticipation is coming a little too soon. This is a portrait of this family that is preparing for oncoming grief, a granddaughter that is preparing. In After Melancholia, a reprisal of second-generation diasporic subjectivity in the work of Junpo Lahiri, that's a mouthful, Delphine Munoz, in discussing the work of Junpo Lahiri, who, by the way, is a really great Indian author, sees a sort of theme in this quote-unquote diaspora's hereafters, which is basically the immigrants' children. Junpo Lahiri is a second-generation Indian immigrant. And she explains that Lahiri anticipates her parents' death as a radical break with the perception of her own identity and more generally as the irretrievable loss of a culture-specific universe. And quoting directly from an interview in The Guardian, Lahiri expressed, "Everything will change once my parents die. Without them, the back-and-forth life my family leads, both literally and figuratively, will at last approach stillness. An anchor will drop and a line of connection will be severed." Lahiri, as a second-generation immigrant, is specifically talking about the anticipation of the death of her parents, but there is still a connection to Billy and her grandmother. Billy's parents, in a way, have sort of begun their renunciation of China. They are American citizens, like they have dinner with white people and everything. Yes, technically, Billy's loss of her parents will be this final sort of severance, but I think in a lot of ways her grandmother is this ultimate site of diasporic loss. Her grandmother is this beloved that ties her to the past, to a China that perhaps no longer exists anymore. The anticipated loss of her grandmother holds the weight of a much bigger anticipated loss. The anticipated loss of her grandmother haunts almost every scene, as well as other hauntings that create this strange sort of spectral drama that, for the most part, is driven by this haunting music. The song I was most struck by was this one. When first listening to it in the trailer of the movie, I thought to myself that the song seemed like it belonged in a horror movie, or at least a psychological thriller. It had this eerie sort of quality that made the back of my neck tingle. I thought it felt almost out of place in this family drama. It was almost straddling this line of doom and restraint. It had an undertone of something you couldn't quite place. In an interview with Hidden Remote, Alex Weston, who composed the music alongside Lulu Wang for The Farewell, expressed that the heavy, dramatic music against images of people trying not to give anything away reveals something about their internal struggle. These characters were unable to express their grief, but somehow the soundtrack allowed a working through of what was really happening. With this inability to address the loss that is unfolding, there is a way in which the soundtrack cuts through the smiles and agreeableness and discloses what is bubbling just below the surface. In another interview in Score, Weston was asked the ways in which the soundtrack was possibly holding the burden of death and loss for this movie, so the film could maintain a sort of playful tone with this heavy anticipation haunting it. Weston expressed, "That's exactly how we were considering it," and that a specific line really stood out to him in relation to this, when Billy's parents tell Billy about her grandmother's illness. "Your Nai is dying," Billy's mom says. Chinese people have a saying, "When you get cancer, you die, but fear will kill you first." I was interested in how this line stood out to him. Perhaps he was suggesting that the soundtrack was almost trying to hold some of the fear for the family. The song first plays when grandmother's sister decides to tell Nai that the spots on the CT scan turned out to be nothing, and they were just benign shadows. It embodies everything that is not said out loud, the loss that the lie represents that exists just in the background, just out of reach. It in itself is the sort of embodiment of the impossibility of mourning, of a severance that is waiting, both a longing to express one's grief and a complete denial of it. The music feels melancholic because it quite literally is. It is embodying all that is unspoken, the absences that make up both the desire and the denial, the loss both of China and her grandmother. Billy never articulates her out-of-placeness or her fears of her loss of connection of home, but it is like everywhere in the music, it speaks through the unspoken. For this final departure from her grandmother, when she looks back in the taxi, I fucking lost it. Like, truly all-out ugly cry. My heart ached from the scene. I felt all of my own diasporic melancholy, grief, and pain rise up. It surged up so strong that I was surprised at myself. Something contained just below the surface rose up in all its aching and yearning. all the desire and anger and impossibility and fear. Fear for my own grandparents' death and for when that anchor drops and I will be left only with absences, when no part of Korea will belong to me anymore. Let's take a look at the music in this scene. They had this redone version of Leonard Cohen's Come Healing. It is a call to healing. I don't really have anything interesting to say about it than that. I think that there's something powerful about this definitive call to healing. It didn't necessarily end in the impossibility of this loss, but perhaps offered some grace for new possibilities. We see Billy look out the window at China, the China that she once knew, and we pass by the old neighborhood that has changed. There's this ultimate loss, but there's a sense that there is still healing and the possibility of healing within it, and there is a way to be okay. There is this ultimate loss, but it kind of leads with this possibility of healing. Okay, so we should probably talk about the end. I was kind of surprised that it didn't end after the tearjerker scene when she says goodbye to China and says goodbye to her grandmother. And perhaps the ending in a way kind of opposed the severance and final loss I was discussing. However, I don't think it does, but I do think that it offers a new possibility for connection. There seemed to be this reoccurring symbol of birds that connected her oddly very nice apartment in New York to the hotel in China. As Lulu Wang expressed in an interview with Slate, the birds appearing in New York and then reappearing in China, for me was, I wanted to put something that could potentially stand for something magical as a sign. But I wanted to do it in a very realistic way. I think signs are only signs if you believe that they're signs. I like the potentiality for magic that she left in here. The symbol of the bird might seem like a bit of a loose thread, but I like that there didn't have to be a specific reason for why the birds were there. It was kind of an indicator that something else was happening beyond what we were seeing on screen. Which makes sense. I mean, a lot of this film was comprised of absences and things not spoken. I think it also created a sort of possibility beyond the losses of the film. Both of her grandmother and of China, there's possibility for something beyond this loss in the realm of perhaps the magical or the ancestral, a reconnection to ancestors, or overall a way to be still a part of a Chinese lineage when you are on the brink of irreconcilable loss. This becomes extremely pertinent at the end. We have this strange cause and effect thing happen with the ending. Billy, reminiscent of her grandmother showing her Tai Chi practice, shouts in New York, and across the sea, the birds fly from the tree in China. Ha! Ha! There is a direct collapsing of spatiality through editing from New York to China. First, I think quite obviously Lulu Wang is trying to connect these two spaces and to express that Billy is still tethered to China in some way, that perhaps despite the severance that the diasporic experience enables, there's a way in which metaphysically, she is still connected. What does this have to say about impossible loss and melancholia? Well, melancholia again is this impossibility of getting over loss. However, with the Leonard Cohen song Come Healing and the sort of possibility of connection that the film leaves us with, is there a way to get over it? To reconnect to this diasporic loss of home? Well, yes and no. There is a possibility to heal, but there's some loss that is simply irreconcilable. There's something that's kind of this intangible connection between these two worlds of New York and China. This magic that Lulu Wang expresses almost offers this sort of spiritual, transcendent possibility of connection. There's something intangible that keeps her connected to China, whether it's her ancestral lineage or just the memories in her own head. There is a possibility of healing and perhaps reconciling yourself amongst irreconcilable loss and diasporic melancholia. In thinking about healing and possibility amongst irreconcilable diasporic loss, I thought about the concept of the phantom limb developed by Saidiya Hartman in Scenes of Subjection. In this concept, she's very directly discussing Black slaves in America, people who were forcibly migrated. I don't want to compare this to an Asian immigrancy experience because they are vastly different, not in any way comparable, and Black oppression is the foundation for most other racializations. However, I think in understanding diasporic loss, this concept felt helpful. Hartman describes this diasporic memory, this kind of connection to homeland, and this place as a site of loss, as akin to a phantom limb. The phantom limb is a phenomenon experienced by some amputees who, in losing a limb, can still feel the pain of its presence, even if it is no longer there. Diasporic loss is a severance of home. There is no way to go back to how it was or to feel fully belonging there. This severance is what Hartman compares to sort of an amputation of a limb. However, although this part of you is gone, what is no longer there is still felt as sort of this phantom pain, a phantasmic connection to home, to this identity one feels like they have lost. This connection is intangible, but its presence is still very much felt. This recognition of loss is not by way of stimulated wholeness, but precisely through the recognition of the amputated body in its amputatedness. Healing is in the recognition of loss, not necessarily in trying to imagine yourself as fully whole. More, it is the very sight of this loss that offers a point of connection. This might seem sort of grim, but there's some loss that just can't be gotten over. I will never be able to get over the loss I feel over my Koreanness. I mean, I've never even been there, and I know that when I do go there eventually, I will be a total stranger. When my grandparents die, my own anchor will drop, and I fear that whatever is tying me to my ancestral lineage through my grandparents will be gone forever. And honestly, there's nothing I can do about that. The combined forces of global colonialism and imperialism brought me here. There is no way I can go back and reattach this part of myself. But despite that, I still feel it. It's still there. In the absence of Korea, I feel the presence of it. There's something intangible that, despite everything, still connects me to my ancestral lineage, not despite the loss, but because of the loss. And for Billy, well, I can't speak on behalf of her, but I like that the film leaves it on this note. Melancholia that has possibility and grief and loss of diaspora that forms identity. There is room for connection, not despite this impossible loss, but because of it.